Hi everybody, here's the month of April, and we're going to do the month of April with our year of teas for Matcha Green Tea. I'm Carisa Bunten with 7th Street Gifts. We're a small family-owned and brick-and-mortar apothecary shop in Newport, open every day noon to 5. A big shout out to the Lawrenceburg Public Library and the Friends of the Library and you for supporting these programs, bringing us back, expressing interest, and checking out your kits. So for the 4th month for our year of tea, we're going to introduce the green grassy matcha, which really, if April had a flavor, it would probably taste like this in a cup. Now our matcha is the Japanese matcha, which in the world of matcha teas is the finest and the most world renowned. And it'll explain a lot about the history and the origin and even show you where they were picked in your cool handout. But ours is a Japanese matcha, so that's sort of important to know because it is kind of the top shelf for the grade A of matcha green teas. And what's special about matcha is we are revisiting the green teas because we did them January and February. Then we went to a black tea and a chai blend in March. But we're going to come back. This is quite different than the first 2 green teas that we did, because those you had the actual tea leaves and they were loose and they were able to unfurl, and as they opened up in your cups you could probably see their original shape and form from the Camellia sinensis. Well, this is a bud that's picked right before it even opens, probably the very time that spring pops open these little buds, kind of like our honeysuckles or some of our early things are budding right now. So they are all picked by hand, little buds, and then they're cured. They're actually not cured, they're kind of just dried. They're set out and dried, and then they're finely ground into like a powder or a flour, just as we would take like a grain, a wheat or a corn, and turn it into a meal or a flour, into just a super fine powder. And you'll see that when you open your envelope in your kit. And again, this finely ground green tea gives you a strong grassy flavor. And besides the strong flavor, it has a reputed health benefits of all green tea, because we've all heard about the high antioxidant levels, the trace minerals, the things that only green tea possess that can't be recreated in other ways and by man or in nature. So what happens with this is you consume every bit of the tea because you're actually drinking the finely ground powder. Kind of like if you had a protein shake, or you make like an Ensure or a Carnation instant breakfast or something like that, and you add your milk and shake it up really well. It's a little bit thicker, has a kind of a bit of a grainy consistency sometimes, but you consume and drink that whole powder. This is just like that. You consume and drink every speck of that tea. So you don't have tea leaves left behind, and you don't watch anything unfurl or open because you blend it and mix it into your liquid, and you drink every bit of it. The thing to note about this that's different than other green teas, because remember we usually think of green teas having a low to no caffeine content. The matcha has a very high caffeine content, higher than our chai tea from last month, even though it's a black tea. And it's almost as much as a cup of coffee. It's off by just like a pinch. So you can really feel the pick-me-up in the caffeine content when you drink a matcha green tea. I can tell it just as if I have a cup of coffee in the morning, much more so than like a green tea that was our jasmine from a previous month, where you can feel the caffeine a little bit, if at all, but this has really got a punch to it. So you also want to think of that when you try yours from your kit. It wouldn't be the tea that you would drink at the end of a long day. It would be the one at the beginning of a busy day or in the middle of the day for like a little shot in the arm and that boost. The other really fun thing about matcha is that it is so finely ground and very much flour-like that it mixes well with baking. So there are a lot of recipes for incorporating it into baked goods in your handouts. I just got one from Frontier yesterday on Instagram where they made a matcha green tea pound cake, and it looked really good. They just kind of looked like they reserved some of the batter of your traditional pound cake, mixed in about a tablespoon of matcha with about a cup of batter, poured in their regular pound cake, and then kind of marbled in the green matcha, and with their spatula kind of gave it a swirl like you would with soap making. And it looked really good. And I bet with that rich buttery pound cake, the green tea probably really paired well and kind of like cut through that richness and the grassiness of the matcha. So it's a really fun one if you're not going to drink it, to do a little bit of research and experiment and make a fun baked good with it, because it really blends in well. I'll mix it in with like my flour or my sugars, my dry ingredients first, and then add my wet ingredients when we bake with it, and I've had a lot of success with it. Again, I just want to reiterate that even this matcha, Japanese matcha tea, this finely ground little buds that are plucked by hand, the very first signs of spring, still comes from our Camellia sinensis. So the same genus, the same plant, and the same shrub-like tree that gives us our green teas, our black tea for our chai, also gives us this Japanese matcha. Another reason why we wanted to introduce matcha is that it's kind of making a splash, or it's become popular in the last year or two. I even have gotten matcha at Dunkin' Donuts and Starbucks and kind of just like mainstream coffee shops. So it's kind of infiltrating everyday culture and society, which is a good thing. But to reintroduce the general idea and its tradition, matcha, when you're not getting it at Dunkin' Donuts or Starbucks, is generally a Japanese ceremonial tea, and it's ritually consumed, and it's used traditionally. So it's steeped in a lot of like ancient Eastern culture and tradition, more so than some of the other teas. And this tea kind of comes with tools, especially if you use it ceremonially and traditionally, as the Japanese did in their revered and renowned tea ceremonies that you've probably seen somewhere along the world. So with the matcha, because if you'll remember, it's that finely ground powder, you really need to blend it, whisk it, or mix it well, like exceptionally well. Yours is going to look just like this, and it's enough for 2 servings of what we're going to do here, so 2, or just enough to use in any of the recipes that are enclosed in your handout. So if you wanted to try any of them, this would be just the correct quantity to introduce to your recipe. So with traditional ceremonial Japanese matcha, you use this special tool called a matcha tea whisk, and it's made out of bamboo. And this is what the Japanese, who kind of discovered or created the matcha tea, used to blend it and do the teas with. And then this is where your ritual or your ceremony would come in. Since I drink matcha a lot on my own, I brought my little stash from home because I didn't want to dip in to any of yours, since we all have them pre-weighed and everything. And then I use my lid to measure, because I've done this for a minute and I know how much it is, but it's just about a half of a tablespoon if anybody's curious. And you'll see the powder. I'm even going to put a little. You can actually blend it. That's how finely ground it is. So you get every bit of that tea leaf in there. And then another side note that reminded me when I saw my amber jar, when you store matcha, yours is going to be a user-friendly quantity where you wouldn't have any to tuck away. But you want to keep it out of sunlight, and ideally in an amber or cobalt or dark jar, because it is affected by the sunlight, and it can be kind of broken down, and its green color gets faded. So it's best to protect it from UV. It's a little more sensitive to it, to sunlight, than other teas are. So this, you would use a bowl ceremonially instead of a cup or a little saucer that we might be used to. You would add your green matcha. And then in this instance, you would pour the hot boiling water over it. And we're going to pretend that I just did that. And then you use your special matcha whisk, and you'll see they kind of spread apart. They're really interesting. They're layered. They're almost like almost hairy in a way, but they're not your typical kitchen whisk like what we would use. They're a little bit different. And then remember, my hot water's in here, about 6 to 8 ounces. And then you just whisk, whisk, whisk. And the thing about these whisks is they like push down. So you like push it down. And you just really can't blend this too well. And then ceremonially and traditionally, and I was telling Denise as we were setting up for the filming, I was in a fancy tea house once, and they made my green matcha with a whisk like this in a really cool little ceramic bowl right in front of me while I sat there and watched them. And then they handed it to me, and then the expectation was, as you sat there, because the person works pretty feverishly to create this tea and do all these fancy things, you sit there and you drink it right from the bowl like you would like broth or a cup of soup. So traditionally in a ceremonial Japanese setting, you would use the matcha whisk, the hot water, whisk it, and generally somebody prepares it for you while you watch. And then you hand it to somebody. And then you would prepare it for somebody and hand it to them. So nobody prepares their own. You prepare for another, and it kind of works in a circle. And then as yours is prepared, you sit and you consume it and drink it right from the bowl. And then you would prepare for somebody and do the same for them. So kind of like a marathon of sorts. So that's a traditional, a very westernized 7th Street Gifts version of just an introduction to the traditional Japanese matcha ceremonies that I wanted to introduce. However, if you like the idea of matcha and you want to incorporate it in, it is easier for me on my stomach than coffee, and I still get that same like content and pick me up, and then you get the antioxidants and the health of the green tea. I call this the Kentucky hack, or the 7th Street hack, or just the hillbilly hack, whatever you want to call it. This is how I do my matcha. I did this at home, but right before I left, I like mine with milk or cream. And you could certainly do this with water, even juice. Cora's done it with apple juice before, because this is a really strong kind of astringent, grassy flavor. So it can take a little bit of additives as far as like kind of cut through it or boost it and take the edge off of it a little bit. So this is just milk with a little bit of sugar, maybe about a half a tablespoon at the most of just plain white sugar. You could put your stevia in it, your artificial sweetener, your honey, or none at all, whatever it is that you would use. And then I add my matcha right to this. And you'll notice I did it in a jar. And I did it in a jar on purpose because instead of a whisk, I use a jar. And then shake it and blend it that way. It'll also settle. I can also take it with me this way, like put the lid on it and go with it like you would take a coffee and drive with it. And then if it kind of settles and sits, because I let it sit for a half hour and I haven't finished it all, I can re-shake it again and reintroduce the matcha and kind of get it blended again and then re-drink it. And so certainly you want your lid to be quite tight. And then again, you can use any liquid you want. This could even be an almond or a soy milk. I wouldn't even have, this is a cow milk, but I would use any milk. You could even do chocolate milk. You can really experiment with the palate because again, this is such a strong astringent flavor. I don't want to scare anybody off, but it is a good one to kind of incorporate or blend with other flavors or at least a sweetener, just so you're not turned off by it the very first time you try. And then look at how nice and frothy that is. My ice really helps too. It acts as a little mixer. And then it gets really good and foamy. And then you could do a straw. I'm not going to do it now because if I do in front of the camera I'll spill it. But I would generally just drink it right out of the jar. And then like I said, as I travel or drive around for the day, I just keep the lid on. And you could even make it ahead of time. I've not done this. Put in your fridge with the jar, like have it ready in the morning. Let it sit overnight. Add your scoop of ice in the morning. Shake it and then head out for the day. And I wanted to encourage everyone else too to try it if they weren't going to do the baked good. Don't feel like if you don't have one of these fancy bamboo whisks, you can't try it. So you could shake it in the jar to blend it well, because again, it has to be blended incredibly well. It's super important, because remember, it's like a powder, a flour, and you're going to drink every bit of it. So you don't want it to have a weird texture or hit like a clump. You can also just use a regular old little kitchen whisk that you probably already have just from baking and cooking at home. So it's not the traditional Japanese bamboo, but it would still be effective as a kitchen tool and to give you the blending and the mixing that you would need. And then a lot of us now do these protein shakes or those workout shakes or whatever. And then I know when my kids bought these at the gym with their like stuff, their scoops, and it's the same thing. It's a powder of like protein. It's a scoop. So you want to blend it really well. These aren't very expensive. I think less than $1 or maybe $1, stainless steel. I'll drop mine in here just to show. And then you can mix it that way too. You just drop it in there, and then that little kind of like whisk of sorts helps blend up your drink and keeps it mixed. And again, I took that from my son Michael. He uses it for his like sports drinks that he used to make. So don't think just because you don't have a fancy whisk and a bowl and you get online and you see all these beautiful ceremonies that are just It's lovely, but don't let that discourage you from trying matcha on your own. Because if Dunkin' Donuts is doing it, you can do it, right? And again, this is a really good boost, a strong caffeine bump without the upset stomach and the harshness of coffee. And I love my coffee, but it can be hard on a girl day in and day out. And then again, you get your reputed health benefits from your green tea. So let's revisit real quick. Our Japanese matcha is a finely ground green tea. It gives you a very strong grassy flavor, reputed health benefits of green tea in general. Remember, different from the other green teas, this is a really standout about matcha, is it has a very high caffeine, nearly equivalent to a cup of coffee. To get the matcha, the buds are picked fresh by hand from the Camellia sinensis, and then they're dried and blended into a fine powder like flour. It mixes very well with baking. Remember, I just like to mix it with my dry ingredients, and there are recipes for baking in your handout. And it must be whisked or blended very well. Rather you drink it or use it with baking, because it does have a tendency to want to kind of clump and settle. So it's important that it gets whisked or blended very, very well. You could even put it in a blender or a smoothie like maker if you've got that, or add your powder to a smoothie that you already do as like a boost up. So there's a lot of flexibility with the matcha because it is so easy and versatile, because it is that powder. You can work it into a lot of different things. Again, it comes from our Camellia sinensis, which is just nothing short of amazing. So our January, February, March all came from Camellia sinensis, and then our April matcha did as well. And then we've talked about how matcha has kind of made its way into culture and mainstream Western society. You can even get green tea matchas at Dunkin', Starbucks, and coffee shops. And then it's ritually consumed, and it's deeply steeped in Japanese tradition as a ceremonial tea, where you use a special tool and a bowl and you drink it in a special manner and prepare it for others, and then consume what was prepared for you by someone else. So we just wanted to visit and touch on the tradition and the wisdom that basically gave us the matcha today. So in conclusion, for the month of April, 7th Street Gifts in the Lawrenceburg Public Library did Japanese matcha tea, a finely ground green tea that gives you a lot of caffeine and a lot of flavor. You're going to get a handout just like this, and your matcha just like this. And remember, this one's not going to be in a muslin bag. This is the loose matcha powder in your food grade wax envelope. So you want to open it up really carefully and expect it to be a nice layer of powder at the bottom. And again, 2 nice big beverages, or enough to use and incorporate into any of the recipes for baked goods. And check out that pound cake too. I'm sure if you just Googled it, like matcha baking recipes, a plethora of things would come up. So thanks a lot. We'll see you next month.